Right, guys, welcome back. Last time we finished our discussion on classification, and at the end of that discussion, we were kind of hinting at this idea that organisms that are similar to each other are not similar because of coincidence. They're similar because they are very closely related, that they haven't had enough time to become very different from each other. Because what makes one organism different from another one, or one species different from another one, is the process of evolution. If that process occurs for a short amount of time, you get organisms which are very similar to each other. If that process occurs for a longer amount of time, it allows more time for change to occur, more changes do occur, and therefore organisms are more different from each other. So let's just quickly backtrack and see what I meant by that. So if we're looking at this image here, this is the kind of evolutionary tree. It's what we get when we classify our organisms. These are all our animals right here, shaded in purple. These are all our plants. Why are they in the same group? Because they have lots of similar characteristics. Why are all the animals in the same group? Because they share a lot of characteristics, but they are both eukaryotes. What we're saying is that eukaryotes branched off from bacteria and archaea because they evolved certain characteristics that bacteria and archaea didn't have. Once the eukaryotes branched off from the archaea and the bacteria, those eukaryotic cells, they acquired further small changes. Some of them acquired changes to make them into plants. Others acquired changes that made them into animals. Others acquired changes that made them into fungi. Once that occurred, the animals then acquired further changes, making some into arthropods, vertebrates, some into mollusks, and even the vertebrates, they acquired further changes. Some of them acquired changes that made them into cartilaginous fish. Some of them acquired changes that made them into amphibians, and so on. So what we're saying is that by classifying, we group together similar organisms, but that's not the end of the story. What the classification gives us is evidence of how these organisms must have come to be. Okay? And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how these eukaryotes might have changed into plants, into animals, into fungi. How these original animals must have acquired further changes to make them into the different groups, and so on. So how did these small changes happen? How did these small changes happen that when you add them up, they lead to very big differences, i.e. the difference between a tree and a turtle? How did those organisms become different? Okay, now in order to understand this process, you will have to extend, think a little bit outside the box. What I'll talk to you about is how small changes can happen. But your bit comes in when you think about, okay, well, if these small changes carried on for thousands, for millions of years, can I accept that they might produce large changes in organisms? And that's the possibility that I want you to see if you can accept. Okay? I'm not asking you to believe it without question. I'm asking you to accept whether you think that that's a possibility or not. Okay, let's carry on. So, classifying organisms gives us some evidence that evolution must have occurred. Let's look at the kind of mechanisms, the ingredients that it takes for the process of gradual change to occur. So, the main ingredients for gradual change are these two things: variation and natural selection. Okay, so let's talk about what variation is. Now, the whole reason that I've discussed this particular topic in this way is because certain themes and concepts are very much tied together. This whole idea of biodiversity is directly linked to this word right here, variation. Okay, so when we're talking about variation, essentially what we're talking about is genetic biodiversity. Okay, so bear in mind that those two things are linked. Let's carry on. So we're talking about variation. So the variation is essentially all the different types of characteristics that you can have within a species. Okay? And what we're going to look at is how that variation is one of the key ingredients for evolution to occur. If these people were all the same, if any population was entirely identical, it would make it very difficult for evolution to occur. For evolution to occur, you need some minor differences between these individuals. Okay? And those differences are described as variation. Now, there's two types of variation that you need to be aware of. One is continuous variation. Now, that's the kind of variation where you get extreme values, but then you can have a possibility of every single intermediate value. So if you've got, for example, this is height, you can have people of 130 centimeters or less, and you can have, and there'll be very few of those, or you'll get some very few numbers of people that are more than 174 centimeters. And in between, you can have people of every single intermediate height. You can have people of 131, you can have people of 132, and so on. You get the idea. You can have every single value in between. But this type of variation shows a pattern, because you will only get very few very short and very tall people, but you'll get a lot of people in the middle, in the average values. Okay, so this is what this graph shows. On this axis you have the number of people, on this axis you have the height. Okay, so continuous variation usually shows a normal distribution. There can be modifications of that normal distribution. You'll usually get, very few at the extremes and very large numbers in the middle, and you'll also have a range of intermediate values. Okay, now usually we're talking about things like height, weight, length, etc. The other kind of variation is discontinuous variation. This is when you have two or more kind of discrete categories of phenotypes. Now, phenotypes means how your characteristics show themselves in your body. Okay, so that's what phenotypes means, and the assumption is that phenotypes are generally determined by your genes, and that's called your genotype. But we don't need to go there right now. Okay, so essentially you can replace phenotypes with characteristics if you want to. Right, now usually with discontinuous variation, you'll have a particular set of categories, but these categories don't have any intermediates really, or they don't have to have any intermediates between them. All right, now be careful. You could say that, in this graph here, showing a continuous variable, this is also being kind of categorized, okay? But remember what you are talking about. You're talking about height. Someone can be 130 centimeters, they can be 130.1 centimeters, they can be 130.2 centimeters. Doesn't matter how we categorize it ourselves, but you need to be aware of how something can be measured. But if you have eye color, for example, there's only a set number of types you can have, and you can't have every single color. Now you might say, well, you can have blue eyes, you can have blue-green eyes. You could argue you can have, mostly green eyes with a bit of blue. Isn't that continuous? Well, maybe you have a point there if you said that, but can you have orange? Can you have yellow? Can you have scarlet? Yep. So because you can't have every single color of the visible spectrum, we don't count that as a continuous variable. It's discontinuous because only a certain only certain categories are possible. The other characteristic of this kind of variation is that there doesn't, there's not always a set pattern to that distribution. Continuous variables or continuous variation always shows this kind of pattern, normal distribution. But with discontinuous variation, there is not always a pattern. One discontinuous variable might look like this, another discontinuous variable might look like that. It just depends on which characteristics, what categories you're looking at. Okay? Now, examples of discontinuous characteristics are things like sex, presence or absence of flagella, blood groups, eye color, things which are either there or not there, or things where you can either have only this or that, nothing in the middle. Okay, so bear these things in mind. I don't want this thing to be treated on its own. We next have to look at the causes of variation, and these things are linked to each other. So if you get a question about continuous variation, depending on how the question is worded, you may have to talk about both its characteristics as well as its causes. Just bear that in mind, please. Right, so causes of variation. Now, you got to remember one central idea, that remember that your genes, i.e. a certain section of your DNA, is the instruction to make a protein. And that protein, how it works, defines your characteristics. Now that's a very, very much an oversimplification, but essentially that's the idea. That you have a certain sequence of bases in your genes, that gives you a particular shaped protein, and that protein carries out a particular function. Okay? Now that protein might be an important protein that determines the color of your eyes, for example. Now that's a very simple situation. Okay? So depending on the sequence of bases that you have, you might have the protein that gives you blue eyes. You might have a protein that gives you brown eyes, green eyes, grey eyes, or hazel eyes. Okay? So your genes, the variation between the sequence of bases in genes, so you might have a sequence of bases in the gene that controls eye color. Someone else might have a different sequence, and therefore they might have different colored eyes. And so that kind of variation is called genetic variation. Okay, so that's a cause of variation. Remember, this is kind of separate to the type of variation. So one reason why one person can be different from another person is because they have different genetic sequences for particular genes. Okay? Right. One point. Whenever a particular variable shows discontinuous discontinuous kind of characteristic, it's highly likely that that characteristic is heavily controlled by one or a few genes. Okay? All right? So, and we'll talk about why that is in a bit. All right? So just bear that in mind. Whenever you have discontinuous variation, it's usually a characteristic that's controlled by one or just a few genes. Okay? Because you just have one or a few genes, there's only a certain fixed set of combinations possible, characteristics possible. Let's move on then. Now, when you're looking at other characteristics, namely characteristics that are continuous, they are also controlled by your genes, but because there's so many different categories possible. In this case, it's assumed that because there's so many different characteristics possible, so many different combinations, so many different intermediates, that there must be many genes controlling this characteristic, or that it's your environment that's also contributing to that variation. Okay, let's take an example such as height. Now, or your weight even. Now, obviously, your genes are encoding your enzymes, just like many other proteins, and your enzymes are controlling your metabolic reactions, and depending on how efficient or inefficient or how fast or slow those reactions are going, or what the balance is between your breaking down reactions versus your building up reactions, those things are all controlled by your genes, okay? Altogether referred to as your metabolism. Now, if your metabolism is of a certain type, you might gain weight more easily compared to someone else, okay? So that's an example of how your height and weight are controlled by your genes. However, if you don't get the right type of nutrition, when you're young, you're not provided with the right type of nutrition. When you're older, you don't choose to take the right type of nutrition. That is an environmental factor. That's got nothing to do with your genes. Or is it? But let's just say it doesn't for now. That's not got anything directly to do with your genes. That's environmental factors. So that's an example of where your genes and your environment come together to give you a particular characteristic, okay? For example, you might have the genes to be very tall, but if you don't provide yourself with the calcium, the right vitamins to give your body the nutrients in order to build those bones and muscles, etc., you won't be tall, okay? So certain characteristics are a combination of your genes and the environment, and usually continuous variation, particular characteristics that show continuous variation, they are usually controlled by either many genes or your genes and the environment. Okay? Right, so now we have discussed, both types of variation, remember, continuous and discontinuous, and the causes of variation, remember, genes and the environment. Now, this takes us on to the next part, which is what is adaptation, right? Now, variations, you can get all kinds of variations. Someone with blue eyes, someone with brown eyes, someone with green eyes. That's not necessarily going to give anyone a particular advantage, okay? Now, as I say these things, I can think of how they can give you an advantage. If you can think of how, great. But let's just say that the color of your eyes doesn't give you any kind of survival advantage. But some variations can give you some kind of feature, some kind of ability that either allows you to survive longer or give you more chance of reproductive success. And that variation is then called an adaptation. Okay? If a particular variation gives you a better chance of survival, you survive longer. If you live longer, you've probably got more chance of reproducing and passing on your genes rather than someone who doesn't survive, maybe don't survive long enough to get to, reproductive maturity. That's going to make the difference, isn't it? So any variation that gives you an increased chance of survival and reproductive success, that's called an adaptation. That's a very important point. Things like characteristics that, now, in terms of humans, this might be difficult to understand, because we we lead a kind of unnatural, in inverted commas, lifestyle. But if you think about animals in the wild, any mutation, any variation that they gain that gives them an advantage compared to the other members of the population in terms of finding food, finding nutrients, defending themselves against predators, surviving environmental conditions, maybe very hot, maybe very cold, maybe very dry, anything that gives them, an increased energy for reproduction, those kind of things are called adaptations because they give those organisms a better chance of surviving. Now, I've got this diagram here to kind of illustrate the point. So, the generally accepted story goes that originally there weren't any polar bears, okay? But, they were brown bears and they lived in woodland areas and, they had the characteristics to survive in that environment. As you can see in this case, this bear is very well camouflaged, okay? But if conditions become very cold, okay, so as we go from this kind of environment to that kind of environment, in that case, this guy would struggle. Because with this as the background, this guy would not be camouflaged very well. Now, any member of his population that had a mutation that made them, gave them white fur, for example, in the new environment, that mutant, that, in inverted commas, freak, now has the advantage because they now have the fur color to camouflage into the background and maybe have a better chance of catching prey. Okay? So that's one example of how a new characteristic with changing environmental conditions might allow that new characteristic, or that new characteristic might give the organism that has that characteristic a better chance of survival compared to the others in the population. Okay? Right, so the next thing we need to talk about is types of adaptation. Okay, so we've discussed what an adaptation is, but now we're going to talk about what the types of adaptation are. Now, if you're studying OCR, you probably have the textbook and you will see to your horror that I have not gone into detail here, but seriously guys, all the information is in the book. I'm kind of summarizing it to give you, the kind of framework. Do go through that book. I don't want to just be reading stuff out of the textbook, okay? But essentially, there's 3 types of adaptation, and OCR want you to know the example of xerophytic plants, which have adaptations that allow them to live in very dry conditions. Now, I've taken one example here, and this one example should show you what the 3 types of adaptation are. You might be required to be able to identify what kind of adaptation is being shown to you in a random example that might come up in an exam. So, how do you identify what kind of adaptations there are? So, this is a diagram of the stomata of leaves, and this happens to be a characteristic that gives xerophytic plants the ability to survive in very dry conditions. Okay, so you should know that the stomata are a pair of cells that can open and close by, gaining water, and in doing so, they kind of close or open gaps in the leaf to kind of regulate the loss of water. Okay, if you can close the stomata, you can prevent water loss. If they open, you will allow that to occur. Right. Now, the 3 types of adaptations are, the first one is anatomical adaptations. Now, this is any kind of structure that enhances the survival of an organism. Okay, so if it's a structural feature, it's called an anatomical adaptation. So the fact that leaves of plants have these structures, that in itself is an anatomical adaptation. Now, behavioral adaptations is when when an organism makes a certain response to its environment that gives it a survival advantage. So, the fact that these structures can open and close, the fact that the plant is actually doing something to respond to its environment, that's called a behavioral adaptation. Okay, now there's other examples in the book, but I'm going to be just talking about this one. So the fact that these stomata open and close, that is a behavioral adaptation. Okay, now physiological and biochemical adaptations are ones that allow cellular processes to occur cellular processes to occur to allow the organism to function in its environment. Yeah. So, for example, or any mechanisms that that regulate the movement of water into and out of these cells, that allow them to open and close properly, that would be a physiological or biochemical adaptation. We're talking here about maybe a protein that cells have that allows them to do something, along those lines. And in this case, you have cellulose fibers that are arranged differently compared to other plant cells. So in these cells, the cellulose fibers are arranged in a way that when the cell becomes turgid or flaccid, it changes shape in the way that helps the guard cells to open or close. Okay, so in this case, it's the cellulose fibers, these cellulose molecules, that allow this structure to function as it does. And because of that, that's a physiological or biochemical adaptation. Okay? So, let's just remember what we talked about. Adaptation is, in general, adaptation in general is essentially just a variation. But it's a variation that gives a survival advantage to the organism. Okay, now remember, there's two types of variation, and there's two causes of variations. And there's a link between the type of variation and what causes it. Okay, remember those things, and we'll move on now. Okay, now, as I said to you, having variations is just one part of the story. The next part is which of those variations get selected, okay? And that will be next. So, natural selection then. Once you have variety in your population, what is it that decides which of those variations have the advantage? That's the question here. So, a mutation is not something awesome that just gives its advantage to, that organism. Whether a mutation is going to lead to better survival all depends on what the environment is demanding. Okay, so I guess what we're talking about here is selection pressure. Okay, depending on what the pressure is, some individuals will be better adapted to survive. Okay, that's the idea. So let's look at natural selection. Now this masterpiece was created by me. We're just going to look at that and for a bit and just talk about what's going on here. So you have three organisms here. Now let's just say they represent the variation in a particular population, right? variation in a species. Right, now, let's look at each of them. This one is small and, can get the food, vegetation that's at low levels. This one, I've tried to show that it's covered in fur, lots of hair, can still get plenty of food. This one has its own variation. It's got a long neck. Okay, so just like, in a population of humans, we have some with dark skin, some with light skin, some tall, some short, etc., etc. In a population, you can have lots of different variations, right? Now, none of these in itself is an adaptation. It only becomes an adaptation when we put certain environmental challenges to the organisms. For example, say if the temperature of this region for whatever reason went down, that would be the selection pressure. The selection pressure would be the temperature's gone down, which of these organisms is now adapted to survive the lower temperature? It would be this individual right here. So then, the fact that it's got fur, or more of it, or more hair, that, from a variation, now it becomes an adaptation. Okay, because the temperature's dropped and now it's gone down. And this can survive. However, if the temperature increased and got much hotter, in that case, these two individuals, this one and this one, they would be better adapted to survive. They would survive, whereas it would be too hot for this one, and suddenly the fact that it's got fur is not an adaptation, but a reason why it can't survive. Okay, so adaptations are not just there. A variation only becomes an adaptation when it allows the organism to survive a certain selection pressure. Selection pressure being the key term there. Okay, another example. This individual has got a long neck and it eats the vegetation of these kind of small trees. But what if there was a disease that spread through this particular species of plant at low level, and suddenly there wasn't enough vegetation at the low level, and it was only these trees that kind of survived in the area? Suddenly these two short organisms would struggle to get enough food, and suddenly the fact that this individual has got a very long neck and can reach the trees and is not really dependent on the low level vegetation, that suddenly then becomes an advantage. This individual, from having a kind of slightly longer neck and having a variation, suddenly this individual now has an adaptation. That's important, and that, because it's going to pass that on to its offspring, because this is determined by the genes, this neck of it's going to pass it on to its offspring, because these two aren't alive anymore to be able to reproduce and pass on their genes. The next generation of these individuals will all have long necks. Okay, and suddenly this population has gone from being short-necked to long-necked. Now, obviously, we're making some huge kind of oversimplifications and exaggerations here, but it's the concepts that we need to appreciate and understand. Can't be dismissive of ideas just because we don't understand them. Okay, so that was the idea. So what does that mean then? So the key points, now there are a lot of questions that come up on evolution and natural selection, and there's certain things that you need to say. But let's bring it back to understanding these things first of all. Genetic variation means that individuals are different from each other, okay? Now these could be small differences caused by differences in their genes or mutations that occur, okay? Now this is going back to the idea of genetic biodiversity. Don't want you to forget that. Some environmental factor changes. This causes a struggle for survival, okay? Diseases, a disease that affects a food source, predators, temperature changes, etc. All these are environmental changes, and which whatever comes up in an exam, do please understand what variety of things there could be. But we'll come back to this. Now, this environmental factor is called a selection pressure. Now, you have lots of variation. You combine that with selection pressure, then you have evolution that occurs, because the selection pressure is going to cause most of the individuals to die, but some of the ones that have variations that give them advantages, they survive. Okay, now these we call the adapted individuals. They're more likely to survive and pass on the characteristics to their offspring. These adaptations become more common in subsequent generations, because it's always the individuals with the adaptations that are able to survive longer, pass on their genes because they can reproduce, and therefore whatever adaptations these few individuals have, more and more individuals in the future will have those characteristics, okay, because it's only those individuals that get to reproduce. Okay, right, let's move on. Now, I think I've skipped a little bit there, but that's the essential of the natural selection. Now, Darwin made a few observations, and unfortunately, you not just only need to have a good understanding of the concepts, but you might need to know what Darwin's observations were in detail and what conclusions he made based on those observations, okay? Now, it's hopefully when we go through that, you'll see how it applies to this example, right? If you can understand this example, I think you're pretty much sorted for natural selection. Let's see. Darwin's observations were that offspring generally appear to be similar to their parents, okay? So that's the idea of characteristics being dependent on genes. No two individuals are identical. Variation. Organisms have the ability to produce large numbers of offspring, but populations tend to remain fairly stable in number, i.e., male and female reproduce to make large numbers of offspring, but over time population doesn't increase. Therefore, there must be lots of death. There must be lots of organisms that don't survive. This is key, because that's the only way, when there's a struggle for survival, that's the only way that you get the best, the ones best adapted to survive. If all of them survived, you're not really going to have any change, are you? But if you're always selecting the best adapted individuals, that might give you gradual change. With each generation, you'll find your organisms are better and better and better adapted to their environment. So what are the conclusions then? There's a struggle to survive. Better adapted individuals, through mutations, survive and pass on their characteristics to their offspring. If this continues over a great deal of time, these small changes add up, and eventually they might give you a new species. That's the idea. Okay, now remember what I said. Big changes are pretty difficult to understand. How did a bacterium become a eukaryote? That's pretty difficult to understand. But we might be able to understand small things like this example here. But the idea is that these small changes add up, and over millions of years, you might get one organism that, many generations ago had a predecessor that was very different. Okay, that is the idea. If you can kind of stretch your brain to understand this concept, not only will you have achieved something, but you will understand evolution. Yeah? Next, speciation. So follows on quite nicely then. If these small changes happen through having variations, through these variations being selected by selection pressure, and those individuals being better adapted to the environment than their previous generation, if that carries on over many generations, over millions of years, we might get a new species. But what does that mean? So I've been hard at work, as you can see. I've drawn pictures, I've made videos. You really have no excuses. Right, so what is it that makes a new species then? Yes, I can understand how one generation might be slightly different to the previous one, but that's not a new species, obviously. How does that happen? How do we get a new species? So let's just look at this example. Speciation is the process that we're going to talk about, and we're going to be applying what we've just done about natural selection. We're going to be applying that to an example, and we're going to be thinking now about a great deal of years, great deal of time passing by, and this process occurring with every generation. Now, we have one population right here, okay, a population of birds. Now, some of these might end up in this geographical location, but some of them might end up in this geographical location. Now, here's where the kind of speciation starts. We have already assumed that within this population of birds, there's going to be lots of different variations, yeah? Some of them might be slightly different colors, some of them might be slightly different sizes, some of them will have different sized beaks, some birds will have different shaped beaks. Now, this is the idea, that because different geographical locations will have different conditions, organisms in each different area will have to adapt differently if they want to continue to survive there. So even if you start off with the same species, if they get separated and some of them end up there and some of them end up here, in this area there might be lots of insects such as worms. Now, I'm aware that worms don't live in trees. Please excuse that. So, you know, in this area, birds that will have pointy beaks, any beaks that will allow them to better find and grab these worms and other insects, they will survive better here. In this area, there might be more kind of nuts and things available, and so any birds that have the beaks, maybe thicker ones, stronger beaks to crush the nuts and be able to gain nutrition from the nuts, they will survive better here. So what you might find is that after a few generations, you might find more birds here that have the beaks to deal with the nuts in this geographical location, and down here after a few years, you might find that there's more birds that have beaks to deal with insects. Now, on its own, that doesn't make a new species. But if these birds continue to adapt and accumulate changes that makes them better and better adapted with each generation, they become slightly different and slightly different, but in each one they become better adapted to their environment, which is what we've already discussed. And up here, in a different geographical location, these birds continue to adapt to that environment after many, many years. We're talking thousands and millions here, depending on the lifespan of the organism, obviously. After many millions of years, we might find that these organisms have become so different from each other that they could be classified as a new species. So that's the idea here. So in order for this gradual process of change to create a new species, building on what we've done before, you need a selection pressure. In this case, the selection pressure is the different types of food that's available in the different geographical locations. Maybe there could be a temperature difference here as well because of altitude. But the different environments, that's the selection pressure. But the other thing you need to create a new species is a reproductive barrier. Now, in this case, that reproductive barrier is this geographical location. They're in different areas. Okay? So, let's just zoom out a little bit. So individuals from the same population get separated. That's a reproductive barrier. Each population continues to change to better adapt to its environment, and that process is continuous. Both populations acquire different genetic changes. Over time, they become different. Eventually, they are so different they're no longer genetically compatible. Now, I've kind of tried to represent this in very simple terms in this video right here. So this is on YouTube. Now, just going to pause it there. This is just simply showing a population that has some variations, okay? Now remember, if they were all the same, we wouldn't, when we applied the selection pressure, nothing would happen, okay? Either all of them would die or all of them would survive. There's no, or all of them would have the equal chance of surviving, yeah? But it's variations that give individuals either a better or a worse chance of surviving. So we have some variations there caused by mutations. So I'll stop it again here. Now, when we apply a selection pressure, the individuals with the advantageous variations are more likely to survive and reproduce. So here what we're saying is, here we had two variations. This variation didn't give a survival advantage, so in the next generation, it won't have its offspring there. Yeah, no organisms with those genes are there in the next generation because this individual didn't reproduce. However, this individual had an advantageous characteristic, a variation that gave it a better chance of surviving and reproducing, so there's more of its offspring in the next generation. This then carries on, yeah, until most of the population now has that gene or those genes that give it an advantage. And it's just a slight complication here. You know, the process doesn't just stop there. Further mutations occur to give even further variety and so on. Okay, so the process is an ongoing one. Yeah, where did these where did these characteristics come from? From mutations. So just in the same way, you started off with this characteristic, but then further changes occur and so on. Okay, so advantageous characteristics, adaptations become very common in the population, and thus over time you get change in the population. Now what we're saying is, now that describes how the population, all of them, the whole population changes over time. How do we get a new species? And that's when we need the reproductive barrier. Okay, so when the reproductive barrier is there, indicated by this line, whatever advantageous mutation is happening in this population, it won't spread to the other population because there's no reproduction between these two. Okay, so this population is changing, but this population is staying the same. Okay, now this process of gradual change, the development of more mutations, advantageous mutations passing on and becoming more common, this process continues in one population, but is not passing on to the other population because of reproductive barriers. Eventually, your two populations become so different because they've been changing and not being able to, whatever advantageous mutations happen in this population does not go into that population because of the reproductive barrier. This individual with its genes cannot reproduce with this individual, even though they could technically because they're not that different yet, but they can't because of a reproductive barrier. Maybe they're in different areas, different geographical locations, and they cannot. So these guys continue to change, becoming better and better adapted to their environment until they are so different that even if we did remove that geographical barrier, or that, reproductive barrier, these two individuals now are so different that even if they could reproduce, that offspring might not be fertile. Therefore, they've become so different. They are now different species. Okay, so that's the idea here. Okay, so that's the kind of process that you have to keep in your mind. It's a little bit abstract, but hopefully you can see. I mean, here in this case, I've shown that this population doesn't change, but this population could also be changing in its own way, becoming better adapted to its own environment. But the point would be the same, that after many generations, the two populations, from starting off the same, because they undergo different mutations to become better adapted to their own environment, and because they can't breed with each other, they become so different that eventually they become too different to be the same species. Okay? Right. So let's move on then. Types of speciation. The one I've described to you, that example was a geographical separation. So when geographical separation leads to individuals not being able to reproduce with each other or breed with each other, and they're in two different locations and they have to adapt differently to survive in those different locations, that's called allopatric speciation. All right, so I've just got some examples here. You might have maybe two different islands, and the conditions might be slightly different on the two islands. Therefore, even if you started off with the same group of organisms that have managed to end up on these two places, they might have to adapt differently in order to continue surviving there. Similarly here, you might have a group of organisms that can stay here as well as there, but in that, they might have to adapt differently if they're going to spend more of their time here, and the organisms over here will have to adapt differently if they want to survive here. After many years, many generations, they might have accumulated so many different genetic changes that they're no longer compatible with each other. The other kind of separation is, that's something that can happen within the same population in the same place. It's a bit more difficult to understand how this might happen, but I've got one example. So this is called the frigate bird, and during the mating season, it puffs out this part of its body, displays the color to any females around, and attracts them in that way. Now, what we have to think about is, what if there was, a mutation occurred and changed the color of this to something else? Now, most of the females of that population wouldn't recognize maybe that color, wouldn't be attracted to it. But there might be a very small kind of subpopulation of females that it wouldn't make a difference to. Now, in that case, what's happened is that this male is now unable to breed with a very large proportion of that population, because those females don't recognize that particular color. So you might now have two populations developing, one that can see that color and one that doesn't respond to that color, and one that does respond to that color. Okay, now that's an example of reproductive barriers forming in the same area. Okay, so when that happens, that's called sympatric speciation. Okay, in both cases, individuals are prevented from breeding with members of the same species. Okay, and when that happens, as we looked at here in this video, when you have a reproductive barrier, when you have a reproductive barrier, for whatever reason, these individuals can't breed with these ones. Maybe they're in a different location. Maybe these guys, maybe some of them develop a certain mating ritual that is not recognized by certain members of the population, in that case, you've got two different subpopulations. They could still technically breed together, but they don't. Okay, but because of the fact that they don't breed together, this population acquires changes that don't get passed on to this side, and eventually, even if they could breed together, even if they were forced to, they've become so genetically different that their offspring is not viable, it's not fertile. Okay, so that's types of speciation. Genetic incompatibility. So when we say that organisms have become too different to produce fertile offspring, that's our definition of a species, isn't it? Well, what does that actually mean? So the most commonly cited example would be differences in chromosome number. So during meiosis, during the production of gametes, the chromosomes have to line up, pair up, and then become separated. Now, if you have an odd number of chromosomes, between that an organism has, if those processes of pairing up and separation don't happen properly, you're not going to get the proper formation of gametes, okay? And therefore, this might be one way that organisms can become so different from each other that they can't produce fertile offspring. The other way is if you have two genes that need to work together to produce this functional protein. Now, in one population, you might acquire a mutation in the alpha subunit, okay? It's a slightly different shape, but it can still function. In another population, you might acquire a mutation in the beta subunit. It's an odd shape, but it can still work. However, if you take the mutated beta subunit here, so this individual breeds with this individual, combining the mutant alpha and the mutant beta produces something that is non-functional, okay? Now that's just one way of thinking about how one population could acquire so many different changes from another population that they eventually become incompatible with each other, okay? Moving on. Now, what is the evidence for evolution? Wait a minute, we're going a bit fast. Let's just backtrack a little bit. So, speciation, natural selection, these are all like natural selection. That's one of the big topics, So it's very important that you understand that natural selection is the process, and for that you need two things. You need the variations that we talked about, and you need the selection pressure. You combine those two things, you can get gradual change in a population. Carry that on for many generations, thousands, millions of years, and you could start to get speciation occurring, okay? And we're going to leave it there. Remember, if you've got any questions, you can put it down in the comments and I'll try and respond to you as quick as I can. So we're going to move on now to the evidence for evolution. Okay, now I've got some images here. Now obviously this is a tree and its rings. Now you might be more familiar with this idea that you can kind of estimate the age of a tree by looking at its rings. Yeah, that's the common understanding, isn't it? So similar to this, if you look at layers of rock, now I'm not in any way hinting that the processes are the same, but by analogy, if you look at the layers of rock, they also formed over many years, okay? So, but this is a totally different time scale. Here we're talking about a year for every ring. Here we could be talking about thousands of years for each layer, okay? So the idea is that, the layers at the top here would be rather new, and the layers at the bottom would be rather old. So if whatever you find in the rocks, the deeper you go, the older it is. And the evidence for evolution then lies in what you find in these different layers as you go deeper and deeper, okay? So what you generally tend to find is that fossils, okay, preserved remains of the kind of solid parts of organisms over many millions of years, if you look at the fossils, they show what species might have been present. So you find fossils of things that aren't alive now. So that's the first clue, that organisms now are not exactly the same as organisms before. Therefore, something has happened to give us different organisms from what we had before. That's clue number one. Secondly, as if we look in the same area, but over time, we might find that organisms show gradual change. So if we look in the same area, but we looked at how those organisms, or the organisms at this time, 1,000 years later, 1,000 years later, we're probably talking about millions of years here, 1,000,000 years later, 1,000,000 years later, 1,000,000 years later, with every kind of passage of time, with every layer, we find that the organisms are slightly different than the ones in the previous layer. This is evidence of gradual change and kind of hints to what we were talking about before, that organisms are gradually getting better adapted to an environment over time. Or maybe the environment is changing and therefore organisms have to change to survive in that area. Okay, now the other clue is that fossilized species, in many cases, even though that particular species is no longer there, they show many similarities to ones that do exist now. Okay, hinting that, again, there's been gradual change over time. Okay, so this is the evidence provided by fossils. However, there are gaps in our information, right? So we don't have the fossil of every single organism that has ever lived. And so there are gaps in the transitions that we would like to show as one species we would like to infer changed into another one. We don't have all the evidence to back that up. Okay, so there's gaps in our fossil record, which means that we don't have evidence for the evolution of every single species. Okay, but for some of them, there is a very good record. For others, not such a good record. Okay, one of the reasons for the gaps in the fossil record is that fossils need, special conditions to form. As well as that, soft tissues don't get preserved. So the only thing you preserve are the hard, exoskeletons, or the internal skeletons, endoskeletons. You don't preserve all the soft tissues, or any kind of gradual changes in lungs or heart or those kind of things. You don't really get to see them because you only get bones and shells preserved. Okay, so that moves us on to the other kind of evidence that we could be using. And I'm going to summarize here, but we have been through the details of this before, that you can compare biological molecules. We can compare the sequence of amino acids in proteins, such as cytochrome C, such as RNA polymerase, such as DNA polymerase. The more similar the sequence of amino acids, the more closely related the organism. Again, we come back to this idea that the more time you give, the more time you've given for a mutation to occur, the more changes, the more differences there are between the cytochrome C of organism A and organism B, the more time has passed. Okay, so for example, two different species of plants will have, maybe 1% difference in the sequence of cytochrome C. But the difference between cytochrome C of a plant and a human will be much more than that. Yeah? Because there's been much more, obviously, mutations take time to occur. Now, the more mutations that have occurred, i.e. the more difference in the sequence similarity between cytochrome C of a plant and a human, the more time must have passed. Yeah? And the more distantly, therefore, we must be related to that plant. But the fact that we both have cytochrome C, that implies that very long ago, there must have been a common ancestor. Yeah? The fact that we both have plants and humans both have cytochrome C, that implies that we must have at some point diverged from one common ancestor. Okay. Which brings me to the final point. Okay. Now, questions about evolution or being able to apply your understanding of evolution is going to be very important for you in the exam. Here, I've got just a few examples of, things that I have seen in past questions where this idea of variation because of mutations, etc., combined with a particular struggle for survival, i.e. a selection pressure, leads adapted individuals to survive and reproduce. The genes for the adaptation become more and more common in the population. Therefore, the population undergoes some change. Now, if this process continues from a long time, you get evolution, and you could get new species arising. That we've already been through, but your challenge is going to be to identify how you can use this in different exam questions, and know when you are being asked to recall and apply this information. That's going to be the challenge for you. So you can do past questions. I would really recommend that, because you will see that, for example, when we're talking about MRSA, bacteria that have developed resistance to certain antibiotics, it's essentially this same idea. Variation. One of these bacterial cells has got a mutation that makes it resistant. Selection pressure. You've got to treat the bacteria with an antibiotic. The antibiotic is the selection pressure. That's then you've got the adapted individual, the individual with the resistance. That one survives, it reproduces, and the next generation has got lots of resistant individuals. Okay? It's the same idea. Climate change. How might a climate change make organisms change? So, again, variations. Selection pressure. Temperature change would be your selection pressure. Which individuals of a species are adapted to survive in that new temperature? Those individuals will be able to survive, reproduce, and the next generation will be better adapted to that climate change. Okay? How are you going to apply what you know, given, any example situation that's given to you in an exam? You have to be able to apply what you know. And the best thing I can suggest is that you do past questions and you look at all the different types of ways this idea is tested. Yeah. So, for example, questions on the resistance to insecticides of insects. Yeah, antimalarial drugs with regards to Plasmodium, food production. Why is it important to have biodiversity in crops? Because you need variations. Yeah, because without variations, if you have climate change and you apply a selection pressure, do you have the variations that will allow you to allow that crop to survive and produce enough food for our population? Why are seed banks important? It's because we need to maintain the variety of crops that we have. Yeah. Why do we, endangered species? Why are they endangered? Because there are so few of them, they don't have enough variation, such that if there was to be an environmental challenge to these organisms, i.e. a new selection pressure, there's so few of them, they might not have enough variations to be able to survive. Okay? Therefore, that would mean extinction for them. Antibiotics we've already talked about. Medicines. why is it important to preserve our rainforests? Because we need to maintain the biodiversity. Maybe there's a variation in that environment that is important for a plant to survive. Maybe that plant has an important chemical that it produces that we might be able to use for medicines. Okay, but if we are cutting down our forests and reducing that variation, plants that are of value to us will not be able to survive climate change, human effects on environments. They might not be able to survive those selection pressures, and therefore their species will be gone. Similarly, selective breeding, slightly different. Selection pressures in evolution are natural in origin. Climate change, a new predator, things like that. Those are all natural selection pressures. The only difference with artificial selection, i.e. selective breeding, is that the selection pressure is artificial. It's humans who choose which of the varieties they like, but the concept is the same. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is, regardless of the example, the same themes are tested, and you just have to apply it. You just have to identify what's the selection pressure. Just identify what the variation is and where it comes from. What's the particular adaptation that's being discussed here? Yeah, but the ultimate end is change in that population. Now, what's this fish doing here? I don't know. It's just a random organism. But that's what my point is. In the exam, they might throw up any example, something random, something that you haven't seen before. But that doesn't mean you don't have the tools that you need to be able to answer the question. All right, guys? So that brings us to the end of the discussion on evolution. Okay. And I will join you now for the exhilarating topic of maintaining biodiversity. All right, guys? I will wish you good luck, and I will see you in the next video.